In 1871, the town of Hollow Creek, Kentucky, was little more than a scatter of cabins pressed against the edge of the Appalachian woods. Life there was harsh but predictable. Men cut timber, women tended hearths, and children played in the meadows where fireflies lit the dusk. Yet that summer, the rhythm of rural simplicity cracked under something inexplicable. Loggers working near the water began to report sounds unlike anything they had ever heard, piercing cries that rose from the river itself. Some swore it was the shriek of women in their last moments of terror, while others insisted it was children crying for their mothers. At first, the townsfolk dismissed it as coyotes, owls, or even the groan of shifting stone. But when the cries persisted night after night, echoing across the current with a clarity too human to ignore, fear rooted itself deep in the community. Then the vanishings began. A cabin would be found empty, its doors swinging in the summer wind. Meals sat half-finished, bread cooling on the table, a Bible left open as though someone had been reading only moments before. In one case, a fire still smoldered in the hearth, the iron pot bubbling though no hand stirred it. Families disappeared without trace, their belongings untouched, their lives suspended mid-motion. To those left behind, the message was unmistakable. Whatever was moving through Hollow Creek, it struck with silent precision, leaving no struggle, no bodies, only absence. Whispers spread quickly in a town already steeped in superstition. Some said the river was cursed, that it carried the voices of souls trapped beneath its surface, crying for release. Others claimed it was punishment, a reckoning for sin's unspoken infidelities, greed, and blood debts that ran through generations. The faithful called it a warning from God. The fearful called it the work of the devil. And yet, for every voice steeped in belief, there was another insisting on reason. Traveling preachers dismissed the wails as tricks of the wind, while hunters swore the cries were nothing more than panthers echoing through the valley. But those who heard the screams with their own ears, those who stood by the banks and felt their skin, crawl knew the explanations rang hollow. Decades passed and the legend of Hollow Creek refused to fade. Journalists ventured in, drawn by stories of cabins abandoned mid-meal and the river's midnight chorus. Some left with trembling hands, their accounts etched in local papers as testimonies of the uncanny. Others fled without word, too shaken to commit to print what they had seen or thought they had seen. Even traveling preachers, accustomed to tales of sin and redemption, abandoned sermons mid-sentence after witnessing strange lights hovering just above the dark water. Tonight we return to Hollow Creek, a place where folklore and fact entwine like the roots of old trees. Was it the product of isolation and fear, a case of mass hysteria amplified by superstition? Was it evidence of crimes hidden beneath the cloak of wilderness silence? Or was it something far older, something carried on the river itself, a darkness that refuses release? The cries of Hollow Creek remain unanswered, and their echoes still ripple through time. They called it Hollow Creek, though the name was misleading. There was no hollow to speak of, no deep ravine carved into the land. Instead, there was a shallow river that meandered through marshland, wide enough to carry logs but deceptive in its depths. Settlers arrived here in the early 1800s, weary and half-starved from their journey through Kentucky's hills, and decided it was as good a place as any to stop. They came in wagons creaking with supplies, women clutching children whose ribbed shirts, men whose eyes carried that particular look of desperation, part faith, part fatalism. These were families who had already known hunger, disease, and the cold indifference of fate. Perhaps they believed that here, by this river with its black water and slow current, they might finally carve out something permanent. But permanence was never promised in Hollow Creek. From the very beginning, the land seemed to reject them. Local Shawnee elders, passing through the area on hunting expeditions, are said to have warned the settlers. "Do not stay by the water," one interpreter recorded in broken English. The ground remembers. It takes what is not offered, but hunger made the settlers bold or perhaps foolish. They needed timber, and the forest was dense. They needed water, and the creek flowed with deceptive abundance. They prayed over their choice, asking God to bless the soil, and then laid down the first foundations of a town that would never truly belong to them. At first, it was nothing but cabins and crude fences. The men felled trees and raised rough-hewn structures, while women dug gardens in the shallow earth. For a brief while, there was hope. Journals from that time described the beauty of the place, the mist that rose from the river at dawn, the way the marsh grasses shivered in the evening breeze, the stillness of nights pierced only by the cry of whip-poor-wills. But beauty can be a mask. Beneath the soft soil, the ground was treacherous. Crops failed in patches where the earth turned sour. Wells filled with water that tasted metallic. Fires broke out without explanation, sometimes sparked by nothing more than a stray lantern. And always, there was the river, flowing black and silent, as if it had been waiting. By the winter of 1813, illness had spread through Hollow Creek. Children grew pale and feverish, their skin blotched with strange rashes. Entire families were struck down, leaving cabins empty, their doors creaking in the wind. Ministers blamed poor sanitation, yet some whispered it was something older, something tied to the land itself. Mothers hung charms made of twine and bone over their children's beds. Fathers carved crosses into the wooden doorframes. The settlers clung to both faith and superstition, unwilling to abandon either, because both seemed equally fragile in the face of their misfortunes. One story, passed down through generations, tells of a boy named Elias Turner who wandered too close to the creek. He was only 7, and his mother had called him back from the reeds, but the boy lingered, fascinated by the rippling water. He was never seen again. Some swore the current took him, though the water was shallow. Others claimed they heard him screaming long after the search had ended, his cries echoing from beneath the surface, as if the river itself had swallowed his voice. The Turners packed what little they owned and left Hollow Creek before spring. Yet the legend of Elias remained, the first of many strange tales that blurred the line between tragedy and curse. By 1820, Hollow Creek had grown, despite the odds. There was a small church, a blacksmith's forge, a sawmill to process the endless timber. Families came and went, drawn by the promise of land and driven out by misfortune. Census records show fluctuating numbers, 50 residents one year, barely 30 the next. Fires consumed barns. Cattle drowned mysteriously in the marsh. A preacher wrote of hearing voices while baptizing converts in the creek low murmurs in a language he could not understand, rising from the water itself. He fled the town soon after, refusing to speak of what he had heard. The settlers' response was not to leave, but to dig deeper into their rituals. Religion here was not the calm sermonizing of city churches, but something raw, something desperate. They prayed over seeds before planting, as though the ground itself required appeasement. They held vigils at midnight, candles burning by the water's edge, singing hymns that sounded more like laments. Children were taught to never, under any circumstance, play by the river. Yet the river remained the heart of the town, its lifeline for water, its artery for trade, its silent witness to every misfortune. Some historians argue that Hollow Creek's tragedies were inevitable. The marshland was unstable, the soil poor for farming. Illness was rampant in such conditions, and fires spread easily through wooden structures. These were the natural consequences of poor planning, nothing more. But others point to the sheer persistence of calamity, so many deaths, so many unexplained vanishings, that logic begins to fray. Could coincidence alone explain why Hollow Creek was always on the edge of collapse, never thriving, always haunted? The settlers themselves leaned toward darker explanations. They spoke of the land as if it were alive, watching, waiting. When children died in fevers, mothers whispered that the ground had claimed them. When barns burned, men muttered that fire was the river's jealous companion. Protective charms, once a curiosity, became common. Carved wooden talismans hung above beds. Prayers were recited backward as a means of warding off ill fortune. Christianity blurred with folk magic, and the line between faith and fear dissolved. By the mid-1800s, Hollow Creek had developed a reputation. Travelers avoided the town when possible, detouring miles rather than sleep a night within its borders. Those who did stop often spoke afterward of unsettling dreams, of waking to the sound of weeping outside their windows, though the streets were empty. Traders carried these stories with them, and soon Hollow Creek was known not for its timber, but for its whispers. A place cursed by its own foundations. A town that, by all rights, should never have existed. Yet people stayed. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps the human refusal to admit defeat. Hollow Creek's residents continued to rebuild after every fire, to repopulate after every epidemic. For every family that left, another arrived, convinced they could succeed where others had failed. But the land was patient. It outlasted them all. In 1846, a flood swept through the region. Most towns along the Kentucky rivers rebuilt quickly, but in Hollow Creek, the waters lingered. The marsh expanded, swallowing fences and roads. Cabins stood like islands in a shallow sea. When the waters finally receded, strange things were found tangled in the reeds, animal bones arranged in patterns, crude dolls woven from grass, and once, according to one diary, a human skull with no jaw. The settlers buried these finds quickly, pretending they had not seen them. But the rumors spread. Some said the land was revealing what it had hidden. Others whispered that it was offering a warning. It was around this time that the phrase, "the Screaming River," first appeared in written records. A group of loggers claimed they heard cries while felling trees near the creek. The sound was so piercing that one man dropped his axe and fled, convinced he was hearing the voice of his drowned sister. Others tried to explain it away as the wind through the reeds, but the description was too precise, too human. Like women in agony, one journal recorded. Not the voice of any creature I've known. The town tried to ignore such tales, but the stories only grew. Families claimed to hear knocking on their doors at night, though no one stood outside. Lanterns flickered without wind. Children spoke of shadows moving on the riverbank, even when no figures were there. Rational explanations faltered in the face of so many witnesses. Hollow Creek had become more than a struggling settlement. It was a legend in making, a place where every misfortune fed the idea of a curse, and every superstition seemed more plausible than reason. By the time the Civil War erupted, Hollow Creek was already fading. Many young men left to fight, and some never returned. Those who remained endured more illness, more fires, more drownings. Census records dwindled. Yet the town never fully disappeared. It lingered like the marsh itself, neither thriving nor dying, caught in a state of uneasy existence. A town that should not exist, and yet somehow did. The duality of Hollow Creek, resilience and ruin, faith and fear, became its defining character. To outsiders, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of settling where one should not. To those who lived there, it was home, haunted though it might be. The settlers' journals reveal a strange pride, as if enduring Hollow Creek's trials made them part of something larger, something secret. "We are tested daily," one resident wrote in 1859, "but perhaps that is God's will. Or perhaps it is the rivers." This is the paradox at the heart of Hollow Creek, a community that clung to life in the very place where life seemed least welcome. Whether by choice, faith, or folly, they remained tethered to land that devoured them in turn. Every cabin raised, every prayer whispered, every grave dug fed the legend. And though the town's later vanishings would become its most infamous chapter, the truth is that Hollow Creek was doomed from the start. Its foundations were not stone and timber, but tragedy itself, layer upon layer of death, superstition, and silence. And so the story begins not with a disappearance, but with a creation. A settlement built where it should not have been, a name carved into maps where none belonged. Hollow Creek, the town that should never have existed. It began with a storm. On the night of June 14, 1871, the skies over Hollow Creek turned blacker than coal, the air so heavy that even seasoned farmers muttered prayers under their breath. Thunder rolled across the valley in long, ragged growls, shaking the small cabins that dotted the marshland. Rain came in sheets, drumming against rooftops, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud. It was the sort of storm that demanded attention, one that drove families to cluster by candlelight, whispering psalms as the wind howled through the cracks of their homes. But it was not the thunder that terrified Hollow Creek that night, nor the rain that flooded the fields. It was the sound that cut through it all, the screams. The first to report hearing them was a logger named Samuel Wilkes. He lived on the edge of town, near the marsh where the creek widened and disappeared into dark reeds. According to his testimony, recorded later by a traveling journalist, the sound came just as the lightning struck, illuminating the black water in a sudden violent flash. He described it as a cry, neither man nor beast, but a dreadful thing caught between. Wilkes staggered outside, lantern in hand, believing perhaps a neighbor had been struck by a falling tree. But there was no one. The rain drowned the earth, and still, the screams persisted high, piercing, drawn-out wails that seemed to come not from a throat, but from the river itself. By midnight, others had heard it too. The Johnsons, who lived 3 cabins down, claimed their children awoke shrieking, clutching their ears. Mary Johnson swore that the baby's cradle shook violently on its own, though no one touched it. The Barlows across the road said they saw shadows moving across their windows, though the lantern light inside should have shown only their reflections. Every account shares the same refrain. The sound was unbearable, unearthly, as if the storm itself had found a voice and was using it to torment them. Panic spread. Families abandoned their homes, some barefoot, some clutching Bibles, running through the rain toward the church at the center of town. The storm raged overhead, but the greater fear was behind them, in the darkness by the river. The preacher, Reverend Elijah Harper, tried to calm them, shouting above the thunder that it was the devil testing their faith. But his words were thin against the terror already rooted in their hearts. Even Harper admitted later that he had heard the screams himself, and that they had shaken him to the marrow. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose pale and weak, casting light over the soaked earth. Families returned to their cabins, weary but alive. Yet for one family, there was no return. The McGraws, John, his wife Martha, and their 3 children were gone. Neighbors were the first to notice. Smoke no longer curled from the McGraws' chimney. Chickens roamed freely in the yard, their pen left open. When neighbors knocked, there was no answer. At first, they assumed the family had taken refuge with relatives. But when the door was pushed open, what they found inside froze them where they stood. The table was set for supper. Bowls of stew sat half-eaten, the bread still warm. A pitcher of milk had been poured, but not touched. Chairs were overturned, one lying several feet from the table as if shoved violently. The hearth fire still smoldered, giving off a faint, acrid smoke. But it was the floor that held their attention, muddy prints, smeared and irregular, leading from the table to the door, then out into the yard. They trailed toward the riverbank, where the ground gave way to mud so deep that any further trace was swallowed. There were no signs of struggle outside, no scattered belongings, no footprints returning. It was as though the McGraws had risen from their supper, walked into the storm, and vanished into the river. Word spread quickly. By afternoon, the entire town had gathered near the McGraw cabin. Some wept, others crossed themselves, but all whispered the same word: punishment. Reverend Harper declared it a divine act, a chastisement for the town's sins. He pointed to the charms still hanging in some cabins, the whispered superstitions, the blending of folk magic with Christian prayer. "The Lord is a jealous God," he thundered, "and he will not suffer idolatry." To Harper, the screams were a warning, and the disappearance of the McGraws a consequence. But not everyone agreed. A traveling reporter from Louisville, Henry Talcott, happened to be passing through the county when news reached him. Intrigued, he arrived 2 days later, pen and notebook in hand, eager to capture the story. His article, later published in regional papers, described the scene with unsettling precision. He noted the uneaten meal, the mud prints, the storm still clinging to the town's collective nerves. But Talcott dismissed the idea of divine punishment. Instead, he suggested the McGraws were victims of something far more earthly: violence. Hollow Creek, after all, was not a peaceful place. Debt ran high, and feuds between families were common. Whiskey flowed freely, and tempers flared easily. Talcott speculated that the McGraws may have been targeted, perhaps for money, perhaps as part of a feud, and that the eerie circumstances were exaggerated by superstition. "Fear is a fertile soil," he wrote. "Plant in it any seed, and it will grow into terror." His words cut sharply against the town's narrative, but they found traction with skeptics who had long doubted Hollow Creek's tales. Still, Talcott could not explain everything. The prints were strange too large in some places, smeared and doubled in others, as though more than one person had walked the path, or as though something had dragged its limbs unevenly through the mud. And there was the matter of the screams. Too many people had heard them. Too many described the same impossible sound. Even Talcott conceded that while human cruelty could account for murder, it could not so easily account for voices in the storm. The days that followed were tense. Families locked their doors at night, children forbidden from stepping outside after dusk. Farmers avoided the marsh, though it was their livelihood. At night, the silence of the river seemed heavier, as though the water itself waited for something. Some claimed to hear faint cries even after the storm had passed, echoes that rose only when the wind stilled. Whether real or imagined, the effect was the same. Hollow Creek was gripped by fear. Then came the dreams. Several townsfolk reported waking in the night, drenched in sweat, their ears ringing with phantom screams. One woman swore she saw the McGraw children standing at the foot of her bed, their faces pale, their mouths open in silent wails. Another claimed she heard knocking at her door, and when she opened it, only the river lay before her, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. These accounts were dismissed as hysteria by skeptics, but they fueled the preacher's sermons. "The river speaks," Harper declared, "and it speaks against us." The McGraws were never found. Not their bodies, not their belongings, not even a scrap of clothing washed downstream. Search parties scoured the banks, dragged the waters, but nothing surfaced. It was as though they had been erased, swallowed whole by the land. For weeks, their cabin remained untouched, food rotting on the table, chairs overturned, until the stench forced neighbors to clear it. Even then, no one would live there again. The cabin stood empty for years, a silent monument to the night the screams first came. The newspapers thrived on the story. Some papers emphasized the supernatural, branding Hollow Creek, the town of the screaming river. Others leaned on crime, painting the McGraws as victims of lawless frontier justice. The dual narratives haunting verses. Homicide spread far beyond Kentucky, drawing both curiosity seekers and skeptics. Yet for the people of Hollow Creek, the reality was more immediate. They had lost neighbors, friends, kin. And worse, they had gained a new terror, one that did not end when the storm did. Historians now look back at the McGraw disappearance as the fulcrum of Hollow Creek's legend. Before 1871, the town was unlucky, plagued by disease and fire, whispered to be cursed. But after the first screams, it became something else entirely. A place marked, a town synonymous with vanishing. The McGraws were not the first to die in Hollow Creek, but they were the first to be consumed in such a waste supper, uneaten. Prints leading nowhere, voices in the storm. Their fate raised the question that would haunt every disappearance to follow. Did the river take them, or did their neighbors? That question has never been answered, and perhaps it never will. From the very beginning, the events of Hollow Creek demanded an explanation, yet every explanation seemed to falter under scrutiny. Scientists, journalists, and visiting scholars pored over accounts of the screams, the vanishings, and the eerie phenomena reported along the river, hoping to find a rational pattern that could ground the fear in reason. The first theories, naturally, leaned on the mechanics of sound. Acoustic specialists proposed that the unique geography of the creek amplified ordinary noises, twisting them into something monstrous. Limestone cliffs flanking the narrow river valley created natural resonating chambers, they claimed. A gust of wind rushing through the trees, funneling across the water, could produce high-pitched wails that carried for miles. The cries described by loggers and farmers might, in this view, have been nothing more than distorted echoes, an auditory trick that preyed upon the anxiety of a superstitious frontier population. Yet as detailed as this explanation was, it failed to account for the timing, the specificity, and the intensity of what witnesses reported. The screams coincided too frequently with full moons, violent storms, or specific disappearances, leading many to question whether physics alone could produce such pattern and consistency. Medical professionals brought forward another rationalist explanation: ergot poisoning. Ergot, a fungus that commonly infects rye and other grains, contains alkaloids that can induce hallucinations, convulsions, and paranoia when ingested. Some doctors suggested that the settlers of Hollow Creek, often relying on stored or locally grown grain, may have unwittingly consumed contaminated bread. Hallucinations could explain the cries, the pale figures, and even the children's accounts of phantom walkers along the water. One visiting physician in 1875 theorized that a localized outbreak of ergotism could have coincided with the storm of June 1871, inducing mass panic and disorientation. Families might have fled into the marshes in a state of delirium, leading to drownings that would later be interpreted as disappearances. This hypothesis, however, confronted its own limitations. Many accounts spanned decades, with screams reported long after the initial period when ergot contamination could have been significant. In addition, the descriptions of scorch marks, drained livestock, and the supernatural precision of the phenomena remained outside the explanatory reach of biology or toxicology. Journalists and folklorists noted a further complication. The human mind is primed to detect patterns, and fear magnifies interpretation. Mass hysteria, they argued, could amplify ordinary occurrences, animal calls, wind through trees, or lightning strikes into a collective delusion. Yet locals resisted this framing. Elderly residents spoke of children trembling at the river, pointing to pale, shadowed figures that moved with intent. Farmers swore they found cattle with strange wounds, and scorched bark on trees near the water's edge that could not be explained by lightning or fire. The level of detail in these reports suggested deliberate observation rather than delusion. Even skeptics admitted that such precision, across multiple witnesses, was difficult to reconcile with simple panic or illusion. Anthropologists and folklorists brought an additional lens to the investigation. They highlighted parallels with global narratives of crying spirits or cursed waters. In Europe, legends abounded of rivers inhabited by tormented souls, their voices rising to warn the living or drag the guilty beneath the waves. Native American traditions from the region contained similar warnings, often emphasizing the dangers of settling too close to waterways considered spiritually charged. Hollow Creek, in this context, appeared less as a coincidence of natural misfortune and more as a location steeped in inherited cautionary lore. The settlers themselves carried folk traditions, protective charms, whispered prayers, and symbolic rituals meant to guard against the unseen. Their efforts were clearly not sufficient to prevent the events of 1871, yet they reveal a community deeply attuned to the unseen, a population whose perception of supernatural forces colored every encounter with the river. The conflict between science and superstition was not merely academic. It shaped responses, informed policy, and influenced the culture of fear that gripped Hollow Creek. Government officials sent investigators to catalog anomalies, from soil composition to livestock deaths, hoping for tangible proof of cause and effect. Churches preached repentance and vigilance, blending moral instruction with warnings about the spiritual dangers of the creek. Families invested in protective charms, sometimes incorporating Christian symbols into older folk practices, a syncretism that revealed their struggle to reconcile rationality with belief. Visitors often left confused or terrified, recording in diaries their impressions of a place where logic and lore collided, where the cries from the river defied both physics and psychology. Some contemporary scholars argue that the debate itself may have amplified the mystery. Rational explanations were reported alongside supernatural accounts in newspapers and journals, giving each weight and credibility in the eyes of the public. When a farmer noticed scorch marks on an old oak near the river, the scientist attributed it to lightning, while the local priest insisted it marked the presence of the cursed. Each interpretation validated the other in the communal imagination, creating a feedback loop that hardened fear into legend. By the time ergot, acoustics, and hysteria were debated in regional newspapers, Hollow Creek had become more than a town. It was a symbol of the precarious boundary between reason and the inexplicable, a locus where observation could not disentangle reality from myth. Even decades later, modern investigations have failed to resolve the paradox. Acoustic modeling of the river cannot reproduce the high-pitched, fluctuating screams described by multiple witnesses over years. Toxicology tests are impossible to conduct retroactively with sufficient certainty. And yet, the folklore persists. Children in Hollow Creek still whisper about pale figures on summer nights. Residents report livestock anomalies and subtle scorch patterns. The river continues to carry a reputation for inexplicable noises, and visitors often leave unsettled, their own experiences blurring the line between observation and fear. Ultimately, the tension between science and superstition remains unresolved. Rational explanations offer fragments: wind and echo, fungal toxins, psychological projection. Folkloric and eyewitness accounts offer other fragments: scorch marks, drained livestock, figures on the water, inexplicable cries. But no single narrative fully accounts for the persistence, consistency, or terror of the Hollow Creek phenomena. What emerges is a town suspended in dual reality, 1 foot in the tangible world of science, 1 foot in the murky, shadowed currents of legend and fear. For the historian, the folklorist, and the casual observer alike, Hollow Creek challenges assumptions about what is knowable, leaving only a chilling, unanswerable question: are the screams the product of nature, human mind, or something older, something the river itself refuses to release? Even as families vanished into the mist of Hollow Creek, the town itself endured, stubborn against both nature and the terror that had taken root along the riverbanks. The remaining settlers carried the burden of both survival and observation, their lives forever intertwined with the screams that echoed at night. Survivors spoke in hushed tones, often interrupting their own sentences with nervous glances toward the water, as if the creek itself might answer back. The trauma they carried was visible in subtle ways: sleeplessness, an unnatural startle at rustling leaves, and a perpetual sense of being watched. Those who lived closest to the river reported hearing faint hymns or whispers in the darkness, especially on stormy nights, and many claimed that livestock would behave strangely, refusing to drink from the creek, or falling mysteriously ill. Farmers and fishermen who dared venture too far into the water reported a cold that seemed unnatural, seeping into their bones and shadows that moved against the flow of the current. Even in daylight, the river seemed to resist observation, reflecting shapes and figures in impossible ways. In 1922, a woman named Eliza Hargrove, whose grandmother had disappeared in 1871, claimed she saw her ancestor's face reflected in the river, translucent and weeping. She was born decades after the event, yet her memory of that face was so vivid that she later drew sketches and described it in journals preserved by local historians. Children growing up in Hollow Creek reported recurrent nightmares of drowning or being pulled beneath the water by unseen hands. These dreams were often so precise that some psychologists theorized a form of inherited trauma memories encoded in behavior and fear across generations. Others, less inclined to scientific rationalization, suggested that the river itself maintained a memory, somehow imprinting the vanished onto the living. Regardless of explanation, the effect was clear. Each generation bore the weight of absence, of people whose lives had been erased, but whose influence lingered like a shadow. Descendants of survivors often displayed peculiar behaviors. They avoided certain spots along the river, speaking of invisible boundaries they dared not cross. Some reported auditory hallucinations, screams, whispers, or children calling for help while alone near the water at night. A local historian documented a case in 1943 in which a young man, grandson of a vanished family, spent weeks refusing to leave the banks of Hollow Creek, convinced that he would catch a glimpse of his grandfather returning. Others developed an acute sensitivity to the natural environment, sudden gusts of wind, the pattern of ripples on the water, or even the flight of birds triggered irrational terror. Psychologists studying these families noted a pattern of heightened anxiety, recurring nightmares, and somatic symptoms that had no apparent medical cause. Was this a manifestation of inherited trauma, cultural memory, or something far less tangible? Farmers' accounts of strange occurrences persisted. Tools left out at night would be rearranged in the morning. Livestock were sometimes discovered dead under mysterious circumstances, and crops closest to the river often failed without explanation. Some elderly residents described seeing pale figures walking across the surface of the water at twilight, moving as if suspended between life and death. These figures were never reported during the day, and no footprints marked the shore. Children occasionally spoke of being beckoned by unseen voices, urging them to the river's edge. Witnesses insisted the voices were often melodic, resembling distant hymnals but with subtle distortions that made the song sound unnatural, almost alien. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as imagination or exaggeration, yet the frequency and consistency of reports over decades left room for doubt. As the 20th century progressed, amateur ghost hunters and folklorists ventured into Hollow Creek to interview the descendants. They recorded stories of fleeting apparitions, recurring nightmares, and mysterious physical symptoms that seemed linked to the river. One historian, compiling oral testimonies in the 1960s, noted that children born decades after the disappearances described knowledge of events. No one had directly told them about specific furniture arrangements, locations of missing family members, and even faint scorch marks along the riverbank. Whether these were coincidences, inherited memory, or a supernatural imprint remained unresolved. Some psychologists suggested a form of collective memory, amplified by storytelling, fear, and suggestion. Others wondered if the river itself served as a locus of enduring trauma, embedding the vanished families into the consciousness of the living. Even in modern times, descendants report ongoing experiences. Families who relocated far from Hollow Creek often noticed inexplicable phenomena, objects moving, sudden cold spots, or dreams echoing events they had never personally witnessed. In interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, many admitted a compulsion to return to the creek, driven by a mixture of curiosity, nostalgia, and dread. These accounts suggest that the legacy of Hollow Creek was not confined to geography, it was encoded in the minds, behaviors, and anxieties of those tied to the vanished families. Some researchers framed this as genetic trauma, an inherited predisposition toward heightened fear responses. Others preferred a mystical interpretation, arguing that the river acted as a repository for unresolved death, grief, and supernatural presence. Significant patterns emerged among the descendants. Recurrent nightmares of water, flooding, or abduction occurred across multiple family lines. Children, even when separated by generations, described being called toward the river by faint, insistent voices. Many descendants also reported physiological reactions, cold sweats, accelerated heartbeat, nausea when exposed to the creek, or even photographs of it. Anthropologists and parapsychologists debated whether these experiences were culturally transmitted, genetically inherited, or evidence of a haunting that transcended conventional understanding. Some suggested that Hollow Creek operated as a focal point, a kind of emotional amplifier where fear and memory were externalized into the environment itself. Local clergy offered another perspective. Sermons in the early 20th century frequently referenced Hollow Creek as a site of moral testing, a place where the sins and failings of the living could intersect with the unresolved deeds of the vanished. Families were instructed to pray for those lost, to light candles along the river, and to perform nightly rituals meant to protect descendants from unseen influence. While some viewed this as spiritual guidance, others noted that these measures may have reinforced the psychological imprint of the river, embedding fear and attention to detail that persisted across generations. Today, Hollow Creek remains a place of pilgrimage and caution. Descendants, historians, and visitors report subtle disturbances, glimpses of figures near the water, sudden chills, inexplicable auditory phenomena. The stories told by survivors and their progeny weave a complex tapestry of trauma, memory, and supernatural suggestion. Whether these echoes are the product of inherited fear, collective storytelling, or genuine paranormal persistence is a question that cannot be conclusively answered. Yet the experiences of survivors and descendants make one thing clear. The mystery of Hollow Creek is not confined to the vanished families. It persists in those who lived in its shadow, haunting the living as persistently as it did the missing, leaving an indelible mark that stretches across decades, generations, and the thin boundary between history and legend. The mystery of Hollow Creek has long resisted singular explanation, and as decades passed, speculation multiplied into an intricate web of theories, each darker, more unsettling, and more unsettlingly plausible than the last. One of the earliest interpretations came from local historians who pored over property records, diaries, and church registries, seeking a human explanation for the disappearances and the screams. They noted a pattern of feuds, debts, and grudges among the town's settlers. Family lines clashed over land, water rights, and inheritance, often violently. Some suggested that what outsiders interpreted as supernatural phenomena were the consequences of these conflicts. Perhaps the McGraws, the Harringtons, or other missing families had been slaughtered in private disputes, their bodies disposed of in the dense woods or buried beneath riverbanks. Supporters of this theory argued that the scorched marks and overturned furniture might have been intentional misdirection, a stage set to frighten witnesses or cover up evidence. Yet the precision and persistence of the reported screams seemed to defy simple human cruelty. Others looked to the church itself for answers, positing that Hollow Creek's religious leaders were not immune to corruption. Some believed that the clergy had covered up instances of abuse, using superstition to cloak human crimes in layers of fear. Sermons warning of divine retribution, the hymns at night, and the moral strictures imposed upon the settlers could have served a dual purpose, reinforcing obedience while masking atrocities. Parish records occasionally mention unexplained disappearances of church members, conveniently glossed over with euphemisms like called to a higher service or lost to the Lord's mercy. Some conspiracy theorists went further, arguing that secretive rituals, perhaps of a cultic or fraternal nature, were staged under the guise of piety, and the cries heard along the river were the echoes of victims of these rites. If this were the case, Hollow Creek becomes not a site of supernatural terror, but of organized human malevolence, hidden by fear, guilt, and centuries of silence. Paranormal interpretations, however, have persisted as compelling alternatives to human-centered explanations. Folklorists noted that Hollow Creek sits on land historically regarded as sacred by Native American communities. Stories of drowned spirits, rivers that sang, and warnings of trespassing into cursed wetlands were common in regional oral history. Some suggested that the settlers, unaware or dismissive of these traditions, had violated sacred ground, triggering a spiritual backlash. The river, according to this theory, became an instrument of retribution, carrying voices of the drowned and amplifying the town's tragedies into auditory horrors. Scorch marks along the riverbank, often attributed by naturalists to lightning strikes or human interference, were considered by believers to be the manifestations of spiritual energy, marking where the boundary between the living and the dead had been pierced. Sightings of pale figures walking on water, described across generations, seemed to corroborate a supernatural origin that no human logic could fully explain. A darker, more modern theory intersects criminality and folklore. Hollow Creek may have been the site of human trafficking, ritual sacrifice, or cult activity. The screams, according to proponents, were not supernatural at all, but literal cries of captives. In a region where communication and law enforcement were limited, such horrors could have occurred without record. Anecdotal evidence, overturned chairs, meals left mid-bite, scorch marks might have been the aftermath of these clandestine operations. Survivors' descendants, reporting nightmares and strange behaviors, could have internalized fragments of these horrors as inherited memory. Supporters of this theory also point to the persistence of the phenomenon. The river's eerie cries continued well after the initial disappearances, suggesting repeated events or lingering trauma, whether mystical or physical. Yet none of these theories, no matter how detailed, fully reconcile the evidence. Rational explanations, murders, feuds, cults struggle to account for the auditory phenomena, the appearances of spectral figures, and the reports spanning decades. Paranormal explanations, while compelling to storytellers, leave open the question of how the physical remnants, the scorched marks, overturned furniture, and remaining personal items came to exist. Some scholars suggest a synthesis, perhaps human crime and supernatural interpretation intertwined. Settlers may have perpetrated violence or secretive rituals, and the human mind, primed by fear and superstition, projected these events into the uncanny. The river itself, flowing through marshland prone to acoustic anomalies, may have amplified natural sounds into something terrifying, creating a feedback loop of horror, rumor, and genuine tragedy. Investigators also point to psychological explanations for the persistence of Hollow Creek's fear. Mass hysteria, communal suggestion, and trauma imprinting may have preserved the phenomenon long after initial events. Children's nightmares, reported decades later, could reflect inherited anxieties or suggestibility within families. Eyewitness reports of figures on the water or voices calling from the river may be hallucinations amplified by expectation. Yet skeptics face the same challenge as believers. Why are reports so consistent across decades, across different families, and even across observers raised far from the site? Why do physical signs, the scorched marks, overturned chairs, abandoned meals persist as silent witnesses, seemingly resistant to conventional interpretation? In the end, Hollow Creek remains a liminal space, where crime, superstition, and possibly the supernatural collide. Each theory carries fragments of plausibility. Feuds and murders explain some evidence, clergy secrecy others, and spiritual backlash or paranormal phenomena account for the unexplainable. Yet none of these answers is complete. Even contemporary investigations combining archival research, forensic analysis, and psychological study fail to reconcile every anomaly. The river continues to flow, carrying whispers of the past, echoing screams, and memories that refuse to settle. Hollow Creek's legacy is a convergence of human evil, collective fear, and forces beyond understanding, leaving descendants, historians, and visitors alike suspended in doubt and unease. The unresolved nature of these crimes, disappearances, and eerie phenomena compels reflection. Was Hollow Creek a theater of human cruelty, a site of supernatural wrath, or a place where the two combined? Perhaps the screams are not merely sounds, but warnings, reminders of events the living cannot fully comprehend. Every theory, rational, mystical, or conspiratorial, offers pieces of a puzzle that may never be completed. The scorched marks on riverbanks, the overturned chairs in abandoned homes, the unexplainable cries still reported at night, they all persist as evidence that some truths remain beyond human grasp. Hollow Creek, in all its haunting ambiguity, resists explanation, leaving generations to speculate, fear, and wonder. Even now, visitors claim to hear the river scream at night, a phenomenon unchanged despite centuries of investigation. Researchers and descendants alike wonder if some force has deliberately preserved the mystery. Theories of murder, cults, and supernatural retribution coexist uneasily, each explanation partial, each unconvincing in isolation. Some argue that only a combination of human violence, environmental factors, and cultural memory can approach the truth. Others suggest that the river itself, unpredictable, deep, and inscrutable, acts as a container for history, trauma, and perhaps something beyond reason. Ultimately, Hollow Creek refuses closure. It is a place where innocence and evil collide, where truth and myth blur, and where every answer generates new questions. Whether the river's cries are echoes of human suffering, spirits of the lost, or a combination of both, they endure as a chilling testament to the unknown. The town's vanished families, the scorched marks, the persistent auditory phenomena, and the haunted descendants all converge to create a story that defies resolution. Hollow Creek's mystery remains alive, a shadow that stretches across time, resisting every attempt to illuminate it fully. Nearly a century and a half has passed since the first recorded screams echoed along Hollow Creek, yet the town and its history remain as haunting and unresolved as ever. Hollow Creek no longer exists as a settled community. Its cabins have collapsed into rot and ruin, and the river has claimed the surrounding lands with slow, patient persistence. Forests have grown over roads and foundations, erasing the visible traces of human habitation. But the stories persist, passed down in whispers, journals, and modern recordings. Visitors claim that on still nights, the creek carries voices, indistinct yet unmistakably human, blending anguish, despair, and warning into a sound that seems alive. Skeptics argue that memory, suggestion, and environmental acoustics explain the phenomenon. They point to wind passing through hollow trees, animals crying, or the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. Yet for every rational explanation, there exists an account that defies it. Recordings captured by explorers, descriptions from descendants of survivors, and cross-generational testimonies that match in detail despite decades of separation. The question remains whether Hollow Creek's cries are the product of human tragedy, supernatural presence, or an unsettling combination of both. Was it a town undone by illness, poverty, and violence, with grief amplified over time into myth? Were settlers victims of crimes that were never investigated, leaving echoes of suffering that became immortalized in legend? Or did the land itself, once considered sacred by indigenous peoples, retain a memory of wrongs done, manifesting as a force that continues to haunt any who approach? Some theorists suggest that the disappearances and cries were deliberately orchestrated, acts of human cruelty masked by superstition, while others argue the town's misfortunes arose from forces beyond comprehension, where human frailty and cosmic indifference intersect. Even now, Hollow Creek challenges the boundary between belief and skepticism. Descendants of its vanished families recount nightmares, uncanny memories, and inherited anxieties that suggest trauma passed through generations. Folklorists and historians debate the intersection of fact and legend, yet the evidence never settles comfortably into one narrative. Paranormal investigators cite the scorched trees, abandoned cabins, and strange figures near the water as proof of a haunting that no logical explanation can fully encompass. Psychologists, meanwhile, explore the power of collective memory and suggestion, acknowledging the possibility that the creek itself has become a symbol of fear and loss, yet failing to account for the physical traces that persist. Hollow Creek remains a place of unresolved terror, where innocence collided with evil and truth became entangled with myth. Its river flows dark and indifferent, yet it carries the weight of the past, of vanished families, of human cruelty, and perhaps of forces older than human comprehension. The cries endure, whether as echoes of history, warnings to the living, or something more inscrutable. Each listener interprets them differently, yet none can deny their presence or the uneasy feeling that lingers when the night is still, the wind shifts, and the water moves. Hollow Creek refuses closure, demanding that each generation confront it anew. Its mystery endures, a shadow over the landscape and the imagination. And so, we are left with the question, were the screams born of human horror, supernatural wrath, or the merging of the two? What do you believe?